Sup? So, welcome back to the grind. Yesterday on Twitter I was posting about common breakouts. So what type of breakout is most common in an individual season. This is different from looking at it in a percentage or hit rate basis, which we already have in the NFL database, looking at, the career year that most players hit certain thresholds year over year. But back a little while ago I actually did YouTube videos on it. I don't know why. Occasionally I made them even before I made this the grind and started making regular content. And then check those out if you want, where I broke it down year over year, what happens most commonly. But I'm getting better at YouTube, I think. I definitely wasn't best at YouTube back then, but by all means check them out. I've broken down by position. But to take another look at it, like what to expect in 2021 in terms of who's going to break out where to what thresholds, I made a new table in the NFL database, which next time I update it will be in there. It's pretty fancy, but also pretty confusing for some, based on the answers and questions I got on Twitter when I started posting some of the results and making some conclusions on it. And so I've edited it a little bit, so hopefully it's a little more easy to understand. That's this video. That's what I learned this week in the weekly grind. Coming out after the live stream on a Wednesday, which was fun. And yeah, let's go take a look at what breakouts happen most often in an individual year. What type of breakouts do we see, and what does that mean for 2021? So this is a table. Obviously I've got it broken down by year just so you can literally see where the breakouts happen, and this is bucketed now. So these are players who hit certain threshold levels of position rank inside the top 5, inside the top 12, inside the top 24 for the very first time. Not how many they have, not how far inside the top 24 they are. It's also broken down by position at running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end. And so you can see on a yearly basis we have a lot of breakouts if you take into account all 3 different thresholds. And I did a nice average table down here at the bottom, just try and see some trends, create some expectations for 2021, and a 1 year, 2 year, and 3 year trend just to see what's really been popping lately. In fact, let's see. Yeah, that's better, right? Get my fat head out the way. So, one thing I notice, right now I have it filtered to all players, so players in every career year, because I was also trying to filter this through a dynasty perspective to specifically just an individual season perspective. Now in Dynasty we're mostly interested in players breakout year 1 to 3, by and large, because those have the most Dynasty value and also the ones that raise in value the most, and so we tend to target them pretty heavily. But if you notice, based on 2022, like DK Metcalf and AJ Brown were 2 of those second year breakouts last year, and so was Deontay Johnson at 2 different thresholds. But we also have Stefan Diggs breaking out in year 6 into the top 5, not breaking out for the first time because he'd broken out earlier than that. In fact, players who have broken out at lower thresholds earlier in the career are more likely to continue to produce, although there's actually some interesting trends and rules you can develop, which I recently have been written up for DLF, based on whether a player is going to break into a threshold fresh, as in having never broken into another threshold, or break into a threshold for the first time. For example, while looking at 3rd year wide receiver breakouts for DLF, what I found is if a player is going to break into the top 12, most often, like extremely commonly, they've already broken into the top 24. So if you're looking for a player to break out in their 3rd year, which is the second most common breakout year for a wide receiver at most of the thresholds, then you're really looking for someone who has been productive before. And so I broke them down, and what we found is Terry McLaurin and Deontay Johnson are the most likely because they have hit a top 24 threshold before. But then you have some other interesting names like Marcus Brown, Jacoby Myers, New England's wide receiver 1. Hat tip to Cooper Adams over there at DLF. Also Darius Slayton, Hunter Renfrow, and Deebo Samuel. And I wrote up the ones I thought that were most interesting, which is really Deebo Samuel and Marcus Brown outside of those top 2. However, something I noticed doing this is that we have, as you may be aware, especially after 2020, been remarkably lucky or fortunate at the wide receiver positions. Over the 1 year, 2 year, and 3 year trend, we have seen an excessive, or at least one extra wide receiver breakout above the average since 2009. Now that doesn't mean they're not going to still happen, because something that you can notice if you take into account all career years, we see most breakouts most years. And this middle column, for example, is telling you the number of years out of the sample size we're looking at, years, have happened. So 10 out of 12 years we've seen a quarterback break into the top 5 for the first time. That's pretty common at 83%. 10 out of 12 years we've seen a quarterback break into the top 12 for the first time since 2009. That's around 83%. That sounds like a really high number until you realize all the other thresholds are literally at 100%. Like, we see every type of breakout every year if you take into account all players at every career year. Now, if you filter just by those dynasty players that we tend to be hunting, something interesting happens, and this is what I was talking about on Twitter, that we seem to limit top 5 upside if you're only interested in players playing in their first 3 years, like the players I listed in that article, because we lose between 20 and 40% of all players that break out inside the top 5 if we're only looking at year 1, 2, and 3. If we start to take into account players that are playing in year 4, 5, and 6, like Stephon Diggs last year, then we get the majority of breakouts. So if you're specifically looking at 2021, you need, for production or breakout, you actually limit your upside if you're only looking at young players or younger players. And now, bear in mind, that doesn't mean you're just looking at brand new old players. Like Mike Williams has been out there forever. Maybe he's a top 5. I don't think so, based on that particular take. But you're also looking for players who have broken previous thresholds when looking at the third-year breakout. So if we combine this with the hit rate table that we've got in the other tab, that we see most top 12 and most top 5 breakouts happen in year 3. And that's, you know, back to the article I wrote for DLF, where most players who hit either threshold have actually had crossed an earlier threshold earlier in their career. So it's not the Mike Williamses of the world we're on average searching for. It is a Deebo Samuels. Well, I'm not Deebo. Give a second, that function really takes a minute. Josh Allen and Kyler Murray, both within their first 3 years, both broke out into the top 5 for the first time. So that's 2 quarterbacks, and on average we get about 1.4. You know, 1 player instead of 2 players. So we have been a little bit lucky at that top 5 threshold. But if you're looking at top 12 and top 24 threshold, we have seen a lack or a below average of the last 3-year trend, quarterbacks breaking into that threshold. Now, weirdly, this pushed me to some names that I'm not particularly fond of. Now, a couple of the names like Joe Burrow and Tua Tagovailoa, I'm actually really excited about this year. Especially based on their ADP and on the fact that Tua is being faded essentially, even though we haven't seen him play in the NFL. Joe Burrow, there's a slight injury concern, which I can't really speak to myself, but he is set up to break out in the most common year that quarterbacks break into the top 12, for example. And we've seen a lack of that happening over the last 3-year trend, and so that all seems to speak well for Joe Burrow and Tua Tagovailoa. But we also see that top 24 breakouts and top 12 breakouts also happen second most often, like a wide receiver in that 3rd year. That's not particularly a group of quarterbacks that I'm particularly interested in, just to throw out one more particularly, because that's the Daniel Jones and Drew Lock category. However, I don't know. New York Giants are trying to retool their entire offense and run it into the ground in practice, apparently, starting fights and all sorts of stuff. They did get Kenny Golladay, who now has a hamstring strain and hasn't shown much in camp. Not that I care too much, and Evan Ingram has had a drop and a touchdown problem the last few years. I could easily see Drew Lock and Daniel Jones have an improved year and not particularly rise in dynasty, but at least be supporting significant fantasy assets that they haven't been the last few years in Kenny Golladay, in Evan Ingram, in Cortland Sutton, in Jerry Jeudy, and maybe a little bit deeper down those depth charts. Seth Williams is down there on the Denver depth chart, right? Probably not, but I still like to remember his name. He was a pretty decent rookie prospect. You've also got KJ Hamler, who's a decent rookie prospect at one point. Noah Fant on Denver. Those weapons could help them have their first season inside the top 12, inside the top 24 at best, and that return this average trend back to 0 and kind of fulfill the prophecy if this is a trend at all. And it is interesting. Mostly for either of those teams, I'm mostly interested in their skill positions more than their quarterbacks, but if you have them on your team, it is worth knowing that Daniel Jones and Drew Lock might well produce a little bit better than they have been doing, just based on the way careers flow and based on what's happening recently. Also, maybe we won't see many top 5 breakouts at the quarterback position, which also fits my feelings on this season. We've been blessed with a whole plethora of breakouts and phenomenal quarterback production lately. I don't think it's going to drop off or disappear. I just think the escalation of dynasty feels towards the quarterback position is going to plateau a little bit. Don't devalue any quarterbacks for that, but don't immediately be expecting this, frankly, very high quality draft class, as far as I can tell, at the quarterback position. We've got at least 3 or 4 quarterbacks in here are really interesting, but expecting them to do it year 1 might be a little exaggerated in general, and based on the last 3 years, we've been seeing that a lot, and so on average, you wouldn't expect that to happen very often. I'm just telling you, above the average of the last 3 years. Anyway, and so those were my main 3 conclusions. You're limiting top 5 upside if you're not looking at slightly older players to break into those top 5 at any of the positions, by the way. Also, we're less likely to see a wide receiver breakout this year into the top 12 specifically, although there is an interesting category based on where those players in that article I wrote up's ADPs are at. And running backs are much more likely to break out in 2021 than wide receivers, based on this 1, 2, and 3 year trend of the most common breakouts that have happened since 2009 or so. Now, obviously, I have pushed this table back all the way to 2000, so we can expand that, but especially when looking at breakout trends, I like to limit it to at least the passing explosion era, which really happened after 2009, and also keep it relevant to current draft classes, because we do see patterns and changes to when and how often players break out based on their career year throughout the history of the NFL. And since 2009, players have been breaking out a little bit earlier, more often. But you know, that's just something I've seen. You can also filter the breakout year table to include different year ranges as well, for example, and see if you agree with that. Now, this common breakout table I don't actually have in there yet. I just built it. I'm just kind of making sure it all works and doesn't break when you select different filters, and then I'm going to move some of these things around so it's a little more intuitive on how to manipulate it. But if you're interested in it, it is in the NFL database over there on Patreon. Any more common breakout trends I can note? Well, I tell you what, since we're dynasty orientated most of the time, looking those top 3, something that I did notice as well, every breakout happens mostly, especially the top 12 or top 24 threshold, every year, except for at tight end, except for a quarterback. I did notice that running backs are, and this again fits with our general understanding of the position, about twice as likely to hit in any given year. Well, we get at least one, mostly we get at least one type of breakout every year into the top 12. We're more likely to see 2 running backs break out into the top 12 for the first time, even within their first 3 career years, than we are to see a wide receiver. Now, last year we saw 3 players do it for the first time in 2020. Filter this back over, which we're all very with, because we had such a great time with our young rookie players in 2020, but that is in excess, right? We already know that. However, the running back has remained relatively stable for a very long period of time. We've pretty much seen 3 within their first 3 years, every year since 2014, and before that we still were averaging a higher number than the wide receiver position in general. And so, yeah, you're much more likely to see 2 running backs break out into the top 12 than you are to see 2 wide receivers. We should expect 1 wide receiver to break out into the top 12 for the first time in 2021. We should expect 2 running backs to do it. Another way that Gabe Geering from the Open Bar podcast was looking at this was just looking at the overall average number, and then you look at players who have never done it before, like I was doing in that article for DLF, and pick 5, essentially. 5 players on average break into the top 24 for the first time every year at both the running back and the wide receiver positions, with the running back getting a slight average edge. Because again, running backs are always slightly more likely to break out into every threshold because they happen more often, especially within the first 3 years. And also back to that dynasty look there. Something someone else pointed out when I was talking about this on Twitter is that we have been exceptionally lucky at the running back position in the top 5 for players breaking out outside of their first 3 years, because we had both Derrick Henry and David Montgomery break into the top 12 outside of the first 3 years, and as you can see, like the 3 years before that, we didn't get any. We did have a slight run between 2011 and 2015 with older running backs or later career running backs actually breaking out, but it's less likely. Running backs breaking out after year 3 is just a lot less likely. Like, it's the only non-whole number of the averages compared to running back and wide receiver. So that 4th year running back is a lot less likely to break out in 2021 than that 4th year wide receiver. In fact, we see on average about 1 of those 4th year or beyond wide receivers break out into the top 5 this year. So yeah, if you're holding out hope for one of those, this is more through a dynasty lens. You got to remember, these are overall position ranks. If they have their dynasty value in spurts, and this is something we've talked about in the Dynasty Crossroads before, it's something I'm less able, or I don't pay enough attention to. If you condense 200 yards into 3 games, and you're probably going to have fantasy relevance, and that's where backup running backs and handcuffs start to come in. But if we're talking about longer term assets are going to break out and have a lot of dynasty value moving forward, then that's not where we're looking. 4th year and beyond players are really players that are going to have spurts of production. Now, other players like James Conner, who are over those first 3 years, could maintain production because they've already hit certain thresholds, but for the first time ever, the further into a career running back is, the less likely they are to actually break out. That's true at wide receiver, but we do see it more often, and there are also some adjustments we can make using the breakout thresholds and adjusting by draft capital to see that players with later draft capital are more likely to break out later into their career for the first time at any of those ranges. Anyway, those are some of my conclusions. I haven't looked over this data for way too long. I hope you think it's an interesting look. I think it's interesting to see, and I find it really interesting because we tend to be, curmudgeons like me, we tend to be less excited about a player doing something for the first time because it seems just so optimistic, and I like to be so negative. But to be fair, we do see at least one version of most breakouts happen every year. And in fact, the running back position we see, especially within their first 3 years, it happened at least twice. At wide receiver, we happen to see it at least once, especially within those first 3 years, and so on and so forth. We apply the general rules after that. So yeah, that's about it, I think. I hope you enjoyed it. That's what I've been working on, what I've learned this week. I put down the weekly Vegas model to do it, which was probably a mistake because the season's barreling towards me and I really have some improvements to make over there. But let me know what you think. Did I just completely waste my time here? Or, yeah, who's your 3rd year or... I'm really interested in those outside the 3rd year wide receivers because, again, they have some of the 20 to 40% of those top 5 breakouts happen after the 4th year, and I think we start to hunt or seek or target players a little less. Even Stephon Diggs, whose ADP dropped last year after going to Buffalo, and yet we have 20 to 40% loss of the total number of top 5 breakouts happen if you're only looking at those first 3 years. It's not that those early year players don't have that level of upside, but for example, at the wide receiver position, the average age of players in the top 12 is 27 years old. The majority of players in those ranks are slightly older, and then you have the Justin Jeffersons and the Odell Beckhams, and we have at least one every year who's a young player inside those top 12 and inside that top 5. In fact, I'm going to show you this again. Something that I notice is, especially when you parallel the running back and wide receiver positions, it's really hard to see the difference, right? We see about the average number of breakouts at both thresholds. Now, this is something the repeatability research we've done, the repeatability tab in the database shows us that wide receivers are actually a little bit more likely to repeat than running backs, but in terms of the number of players who break out for the first time into those thresholds, especially when considering all career years, is relatively even. It's only when we go to that dynasty level threshold of within the first 3 years that it really shows up. The 2 running backs don't repeat, and therefore new players break into the top 5, whereas only 1 wide receiver doesn't repeat and therefore one breaks into the top 5. And so it's a little hard to see the separation between the positions, because on the whole, they reflect each other a lot more than we tend to display in the discourse. There's about the same number of players at each position, at each threshold, that break out, and therefore about the same number that stop being in that threshold in order to make room for those breakouts. It's really only when you dig in a little bit that you see that running backs don't repeat quite as often in the top 5 as wide receivers. And again, wide receivers break out after year 4 if they have crossed the previous threshold fairly often. Stefan Diggs last year and everything else. But at this point I feel like I'm back to just talking about interesting things instead of making a successful YouTube channel. So yeah, let me know what you think. Like, comment, subscribe, check out the database if you're interested in it. I don't have this in there yet. I have the hit rate table in there, but this frequency or commonality a breakout table, again, like I say, I'm just fine-tuning it, and then I'll include it next time I update the database. Anyway, thanks very much for checking it out. Talk to you again next time. Bye.